We're going to look at the future of Chautauqua Lake today and see what the future holds for the lake. We have a number of topics and a number of items to discuss. We'll start by looking at the shape of the watershed, because this is going to play the most dynamic role in what happens to the future of the lake. What happens within each of these watersheds? You can see here the size of the Goose Creek watershed, the size of the Prendergast watershed, the size of the DeWittville watershed, the size of the Big Inlet watershed. As we look at these watersheds, there's one thing to keep in mind. Most of the watersheds from the Big Inlet around along the westerly shore of the lake down to and including Goose Creek has sub-basins with long, low gradients in each of the streams. When we move to the east side of the watershed and get into DeWittville Creek, Maple Springs, Bemis, and Dutch Hollow Creek, we run into much steeper watersheds, a heritage of the geological history, and we have a different set of erosion equations for these streams along this side. Probably the first thing that we're concerned about when we look at the watershed and the future of the lake itself is what is the nutrient loading going to be? And we're going to look at two sources of nutrient loading: the watershed itself and the activities in the watershed, and then cultural activities around the shores of the lake. Probably the greatest change, there are going to be two great changes take place. One is going to be in the watershed in general, and then there's going to be intensive activity in all of these small, minor watersheds, basically between the perimeter road or the peripheral roads around the lake and the lake itself. So we'll talk about those two parts. The watershed in general. Aerial photography dating back to 1937 and 38 up to this year shows us that there is a dynamic change taking place in the general watershed and in the majority of the 180 square miles of the watershed. The change is back to brush and woodlands. Farming is disappearing from the watershed, with one exception. We have the Amish people up in this corner there that are aggressively farming, but they farm in a different manner than we've seen generally in the watershed. Acres upon acres of land are no longer tilled. Acres and acres of land, we're talking about thousands of acres of land, are no longer pastured. The Agricultural Act of 1985 has taken a lot of the dairy farms out of the watershed. There are still literally a handful of big dairy farms in the watershed, and that's it. Farming activities, the farmer has become a much more alert person in how he uses his resources. He doesn't use fertilizer the way he did a decade ago. He applies manure in a different manner than he did a decade ago. And those things are all going to be positive as far as the lake itself is concerned. Remember the lake and the retention period in the lake. Water retention in the upper basin, 526 days. Water retention in the lower basin, 105 days. And if you look at some of the chemical concentrations that we've done in some of our studies, you find that as you go down lake, chemical concentrations increase as if you're dealing with a huge sugaring pan. When one makes maple syrup, the concentration gets chemistry, biological activity, etc., increases as you come down lake. So in terms of nutrient loading, we're going to have a plus factor in the vast majority of the area. By plus, I mean the nutrient loading is going to be reduced. The challenge area is going to be near shore, where we have cultural activities, in the operation of sewage treatment plants, in the addition of additional sewage disposal facilities. However, the rules and regulations that exist today and the sewer systems that exist today realize that all of the sewage from this point, which is Asheville Bay, all the way around the lake and all the way up the lake to Midway Park, all of the sewage that is generated in the center and the South Chautauqua Lake Sewer District is now discharged in the outlet of the lake. We then have a major sewage treatment plant at Mayville serving a northern portion of the lake and the Chautauqua Institution plant. And then we have sewer plants at private developments such as Crosswind, Chedwell's, but these all meet standards that didn't exist in 1965. And therefore the contribution in terms of total nutrient loading, if these plants are operated correctly and the new plants that would be added are operated correctly, there will not be a significant increase back to historic levels that we had years ago. Sedimentation. Sedimentation rates, basically it depends upon which one of these streams you want to talk about and what is happening in the streams. Dutch Hollow Creek has the highest gradient of any of the streams feeding into Chautauqua Lake. It has the most aggressive growing delta of the streams in the watershed. Farming, for all practical purposes, there's very, very little plowing done in this watershed anymore. I don't know that there's a major farm left in the Dutch Hollow Creek watershed. Go back 20 years and you have an entirely different picture. So is the case along this side of the watershed. We have sedimentation rates that will decline as agricultural activity declines. However, there's one thing to be remembered about sedimentation in Chautauqua Lake. We can talk about averages, and I believe that the average sedimentation rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.02 of an inch per year. However, you can get an epic storm. If you remember the storm that flooded the Lakewood Mall not too many years after it was developed, that storm only was in that single little small watershed. It wasn't reflected anyplace else in the watershed. Then several years ago, we had that storm that took out the bridge in Panama. That storm was represented in these three watersheds, basically the Prendergast Ball Creek and the Goose Creek watershed. And they deposited significant amounts of sedimentation into the lake at their mouths. Then I have the record in 1982 of a 2-inch rainstorm that lasted 1 hour up in the DeWittville, Big Inlet, Mud Creek, Little Inlet, and Lighthouse watershed, and it was not reflected anyplace else in the watershed. Those can create, with each of those storms, quite a bit of sediment loading. But when you average it out, we're talking about a very, very low rate. When you talk about sediment, you talk about erosion. Again, because of the land use pattern that is taking place, erosion rates are going down. And all of the governments around the shores of Chautauqua Lake now have a cooperative agreement of one form or another with the Ag Center. It used to be called the Soil and Water Conservation District, but I think they've changed the title, to work with them when there is a development of any significance that takes place. Ellery, Busti, Lakewood, North Harmony, and Chautauqua. Realize what Fran Morgan and the town board of the town of Ellicott did with the development of the Wegmans and the Kmart site. They have a stormwater retention basin for two purposes, so that this runoff doesn't flood people downstream and also to pick up sediment. So we do have already guidelines and suggestions by people of Chautauqua County that they are interested in the future of the lake, and they're doing something about it. The great unknown in Chautauqua Lake is a new addition. It's the zebra mussel. What the zebra mussel is going to portend for the lake, we don't know. If it is going to act like it did in the Great Lakes, it's going to give us clearer water. But the question again being, the hydraulics of the lower lake, is the zebra mussel going to be powerful enough to take out the algae bloom in August in the lower lake? I doubt it, but only time will tell. Another challenge that we have for those of us that spend time on the lake is the fishing resource. I have talked with a number of people, and we have a number of fishing organizations, some oriented to the bass, some oriented to the muskellunge, and many of those people that belong to those organizations now do a catch and release. But every once in a while, you get something that you want to take home. I would suggest to you that the smallmouth bass fishing, the largemouth bass fishing on the lake has changed in the 40 years that I have known the lake. The competition for those fish is much greater than it was 40 years ago. We now have a limit on almost every fish of any consequence in the lake except for the perch. And the sunfish, of course. But the other fish we have a limit on, and I think wisely so. I believe that the fishing resource will remain with us. But again, what is the zebra mussel going to do as it has been interjected into the food chain? Better yet, what has the walleye pike done? Because if we read the literature on the lake, we find that the walleye pike was not found in the 1937 study, but it was alluded to in that report. And of course, I've been eating walleye pike out of Chautauqua Lake since the early 1960s. We have the walleye pike that's in there now that we know about. We have a silver bass. We have several other introductions to the lake. But basically, for those of us that want to fish, if we understand how to fish for the particular fish that we're interested in, I believe they will be here. They will be more difficult to catch. I usually averaged 15 hours for a keeper muskellunge when a muskellunge only had to be 32 inches. I've gone all the way up to 25 hours of fishing now before I get a 40-inch muskellunge that I may keep under the fishing regulations. Catch a lot of fish, turn a lot of them loose. The question is going to be the amount of competition that takes place. As we continue to promote the lake as a fishing resource and as a contest site, it may very well be that the number of fish that are available for us will be reduced, unless we get more and more involved in the fish and release programs that we see with some of the clubs that now fish Chautauqua Lake. Algae blooms. Anytime we have a good spring freshet, the melting of the snow, anytime we have a good rainstorm with high runoff, within several days of that incident, we begin to get an algae bloom. It's a combination of temperature and nutrient availability. The big storm runoffs and the spring freshets, those years that we have it, give us our major elements of our nutrient loading for the lake. And you can see that they get concentrated in various areas. So you're going to get a tremendous amount of nutrient loading off of the Goose Creek, off the Pendergast Creek. Realize that we have never been able to measure a flow through the lake. We've never had the resources to do a flow study, but we know about the retention calculations that can be made for each of these lakes. When you say 105 days or 106 days for the lower lake, realize that's averaged over the year. Remember that from April through to December 1st, we try to control the lake elevation and maintain the lake elevation. Therefore, most of the flows take place outside of those dates. In other words, from December 1st until about April 1st is when we get most of our flow out of the lake. Rooted aquatic plants. My first recollection of Chautauqua Lake deals with a series of bulrushes up in Hartfield Bay. And I can remember being out with my father-in-law and casting in amongst the bulrushes and having wonderful follow-ups of large muskellunge. I believe that people that have been on the lake for the last 20 years don't even know about the fact that there were bulrushes in the upper lake. Because of the fact that we have maintained a lake elevation program in the summer months, basically aggressively since 1976, and kind of before that, starting back in about 1960, we have changed the aquatic vegetation patterns within the lakes. These bulrushes are gone. There are a number of places where bulrushes used to be. They no longer exist. We only have a few places of lily pads and bulrushes. That's a combination of changing and maintaining a summer lake elevation as well as our history of using some chemicals on the lake. By the way, in all instances that we use chemicals on the lake, they were done under a State Department of Environmental Conservation permit of one form or another. We've learned a lot about rooted aquatic plants as I've lived in Chautauqua County. We once thought that the rooted aquatics took most of their nutrient loading out of the water column. Then they changed and said, no, they take it out of the sediments. And now they're telling us, depending upon pH and temperature and the amount of light, the plants can be selective about when and where they take it. We also have the challenge that most of our rooted aquatics come up aggressively in the spring of the year and then kind of just grow through the rest of the year. The Lake Association is harvesting these plants. Milfoil used to be the villain. If we go back a decade and look at the amount of material that was taken out of the lake by the Lake Association, we would find that an extremely high percentage of the plant taken out was milfoil. In talking with the executive director of the Lake Association late this fall, he said that milfoil represented possibly 5% or less of the plants that were mowed. So we've had that type of change. With the nutrient loading as we have changed it, my estimation is a reduction of 55% or better of the phosphorus loading in the lake. We have changed the competition of the rooted aquatics in the lake. Depending upon what the zebra mussel does, if the zebra mussel is going to eat the algae and lock up the nutrient loading in such a manner that we have better sunshine penetration through various parts of the lake, basically the lower lake, we're going to find more area in the lower lake is going to become available to the growth of rooted aquatics. Speculation. We really don't know. The other challenge that you and I really have to understand about the lake is the question of flooding. Flooding on Chautauqua Lake is of historic record, and over on the easel I have pictures of a document that was created in 1980 as a document that I carried around the shores of the lake and put on everybody's doorstep or doorknob on the east side of the lake until I got chewed up by too many dogs. And then the rest of them I put in the local grocery stores. But this handout deals with the history of the Chautauqua Lake level, elevation, and flooding. The document is available through the County Planning Department, and anybody that is truly interested in the lake level and the potentials of what can happen on the lake, I strongly recommend that they call the Chautauqua County Department of Planning in Mayville and ask for a copy of the document. It's a handout, it's a foldout, and it'll give you the lake management scheme for the water level. It discusses the incidence of flooding. But realize this, we have not experienced the maximum possible storm that could be placed in the watershed of Chautauqua Lake. The maximum possible storm is some 23 inches of rainstorm in 36 hours. It would happen in the summer. It would probably be some type of a tropical storm coming off the Gulf or up off of Cuba. Basically, though, the work that has been done with the federal flood insurance suggests to us that the difference between a 10-year incident and a 500-year incident of high water on the lake is a total of 1.1 feet. So it's not a significant thing, but realize that we're talking about frequency, and frequency is a mathematical probability, and when we talk about the maximum possible storm that could give us a lake elevation of 1319, something no one can conceive of, because in the time that I've known the lake, the most we've had is a 1313 elevation. That elevation happened in 1913 and again in 1918. Those incidences in both cases were spring freshets. Realize that the watershed in its totality can store up 4 to 6 inches of water in the snowpack, and then you get a February rain or a March rain, and that snowpack and the rain itself all come loose and come into the watershed. But never has it given us a lake elevation that exceeds much above 1313. Based on the work that we have done in the past, for people that are going to build around the shoreline of the lake in the future, my personal recommendation to you is don't build below an elevation of 1,313.5 feet. How do you identify that elevation? On a daily basis in the Post-Journal, usually on the second page, just before the obituaries, there is a daily almanac. And in that daily almanac, you have published down in the corner of it in its present format, you have the daily lake elevation. And I would suggest to you that when and if you are going to build around the shores of Chautauqua Lake, or someone is going to build around the shores of Chautauqua Lake, that they see what the stilled elevation was on that particular morning, and then put a tank or a tube out in front of their property and get their own stilled elevation, and then proceed to build above an elevation of 1,313.5 feet above mean sea level. And anybody that's going to remodel that is now has a home below that level, I would strongly recommend that they, as they remodel, they build to that new elevation. It's in the Post-Journal, Daily Almanac, almost every day. As Devin Taylor says, some days they miss it. That's true, but it doesn't happen very often. The last thing that I want to talk about, and I can disappear into this one, is what's going to happen on the surface activity of the lake. As more and more properties are built, the question is, will the undeveloped property of today become developed property of tomorrow, and will it be developed in a different manner? Realize that most of the recent development around the lake in the last 2 decades has taken place in depth. Point Chautauqua, Crosswinds, Chedwells, the development in the town of Ellery, and right now it's Cedar Crest. These are in-depth developments. They're not just shoreline developments. There's not much left in the way of raw shoreline except in the quasi-public holdings and the public holdings of the lake. The biggest owner of lakefront on Chautauqua Lake is the state of New York. That includes Long Point State Park, the fish hatchery, Tom's Point, and the boat landing at Bemis Point. The next biggest owner is the village of Mayville with its lakefront park. And then we go down rapidly in terms of number, the village of Lakewood, the village of Cellaround, the town of Ellicott, the village of Bemis Point. The town of Chautauqua, the town of North Harmony, the town of Bustye, and the town of Ellery have road frontages into the lake. There's about 100 of them, and each road frontage has a different set of restrictions on it as to whether or not the road frontage is a public road or it is a private development road and only certain people have access to it. So the question is, what is the future surface use of the lake going to be? Very simple. I believe, as it is now, that on 4th of July weekend and Labor Day weekend, stay off the lake. There are just too many people that want to get on the lake. But I would also suggest to you that in the middle of July, on a Wednesday afternoon, if you're out sailing on a sailboat and you don't have a life vest on, and you fall overboard, and the rest of the people partying on the boat don't notice that you've fallen overboard, you could perish out there. There aren't that many people on the lake on Wednesday. However, on Saturday or Sunday or Friday evening, you may end up with propeller tracks up and down your back. But only on certain weekends. As future activity takes place, we're going to have to discuss, as they have in many other places in the nation, whether or not use activity may be restricted on the lake. But I think that's well down the road. That's decades down the road before that will happen. Realize that one of the most exciting and most passive uses of the lake is just looking at it and enjoying it. And then there's another group of people that are just coming along that are really thrilled about the lake. They're thrilled about the lake in the area of Burtis Bay. They're thrilled about the lake at the mouth of Bemis Creek. And they're thrilled about the lake in the vicinity of Hartfield. And if you can get down in along the shore of Chautauqua Institution and drive along the shoreline there, in the spring of the year, in the fall of the year, you get your migratory waterfowl. And you would be surprised at the number of people that are now absolutely entranced by that activity, going out and looking. These birds are moving, of course. They start, as an example, the first migratory birds that I spotted this year, about the 15th of August, a family of loons came down from the north, a pa and 3 little ones, and they're on their way south already. The birds are there until it ices up, and sometimes the outlet of the lake doesn't ice up, and we get quite an accumulation east of the village of Celeron in the outlet of the lake. Ice up is an important time. And then if you are on the lake the day the ice goes out, come back the next day and you'll find mallard ducks, pairs of them, about 100 meters apart, all the way around the shore of the lake, the whole shoreline of the lake. And they're already going in to find a nest. However, in March you'll find that the birds in the outlet already have young. And maybe the ice hasn't gone out on the rest of the lake at that time. But the surface use is going to be a challenge. The activities, the types of vessels that we're allowed to use, we're going to discuss more and more. The noise level. There are people now that would like to see Chautauqua Lake made into a migratory waterfowl preserve and have hunting taken off of that. The wide range. There are others of us. I was once a great duck hunter on Chautauqua Lake and used to enjoy a wonderful afternoon of duck hunting and picking up my limit without any problem. The duck populations are coming back. We have a resident Canadian goose population that is of such size that we now have a resident goose hunt throughout most of the state of New York. These things will change. Boating, we're going to see, I think in the not too distant future, something about noise level of motors. When John Bentley was sheriff, he was not too interested in it. I don't know that Joe Gerasi has the time and the resources to be interested in it, but I think those of us around the watershed that live on the shore of the lake would like to see something done about noise levels on the lake. Based on some work that has just been completed by the planning department, there is the issue of the wave rider and the danger of that vehicle and the noise that that vehicle brings to us. Then we have the conflict between the fisherman and the sailboater. And if you look at the navigational laws, it's settled in those documents as to who has the right of way. And anybody that is using the surface waters of the lake should have enough sense to understand the navigational laws of the state of New York. There are several organizations around the shores of the lake that will provide you with the rules and regulations dealing with surface activity on the lake. The biggest piece of time that people take from the lake is just enjoying its serenity most of the time. Those of us that live on the easterly side of the lake just have a wonderful time looking at a fall sunset or any time of year sunset. Those that live on the east side deal with the question of dawn and dawn activities. It's your lake, it's my lake, we can protect it. The future of the lake is bright if we respect its geological history and what we have in the lake at this time. There is no reason why the quality of the water for swimming, for drinking, for boating should deteriorate. In matter of fact, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to improve the quality of the water in Chautauqua Lake to a higher level than it is today. The matter of fact is that maybe the zebra mussel will do it for us. Only time will tell.